Okay, the gearbox is out of the truck, and my plan is to take it apart and inspect all parts for wear and rebuild it with at least all new bearings, gaskets and seals. There's some minor noises and vibrations every now and then, but nothing too serious. I just want to make it strong and reliable. Clutch bell housing comes off like that. And there's everything cleaned up with WD-40, racks, brushes and brake cleaner. There's some play in the input shaft, but I think that's pretty much normal. The pilot bearing is going to support the nose of the input shaft anyway. Transfer case cover is off. And there's the bell housing and clutch fork and throwout bearing inside of it. The main shaft rear nut, I unstaked it before opening with impact wrench. And then the hindmost bearing of the main shaft. It wasn't very tight, as you can see. And next we have the power takeoff drive gear, which is in perfect condition because it's rarely used. During the process I needed some kind of puller, so I made my own with 2 or 3 different legs. The ball bearing in the picture doesn't belong to the puller. I just had to weld it because it was really tight. All the bolts of the gearbox cover are off. And first we are going to remove the reverse light switch. The gearbox is pretty heavy because it's all cast iron except the cover is aluminium. There's the 5th gear arm bolt and locking plate. This is actually the same 4-gear gearbox as in the earlier models. It just has added 5th gear. And the cover is off. There you can see the shift forks inside it. Next I'm gonna remove the 5th gear locking ball, spring and screw plug. There's the plug. And here we have the spring and the locking ball. Just make sure to put them in a safe place. Okay, here's the 1st gear. Works just fine. No problems. Neutral. 2nd gear. I'm just trying to feel the gearbox. Checking everything I can. neutral, third gear, fourth gear, and there we have fifth gear outside the box. Works just fine. Then I'm going to measure the thrust clearance of each gear. There's the first gear thrust clearance. It's just fine. And the second gear thrust clearance seems to be okay. Just making sure that the clearance is true. And the third gear, just fine. Fourth gear can't be measured. Then we have here the fifth gear. And it seems to be just fine. Okay, now we're pulling out the center bearing of the main shaft. And a spacer. And here we have the fifth gear shift arm. Okay, no problems with it. And fifth gear synchro ring and spline piece. There's nothing wrong with them. The spline piece has the synchro cone, no marks on it, and synchro ring looks like a new one. And fifth gear, actually fifth counter gear itself, just fine. Thrust washer with a slot and a tiny locking pin. And then I'm gonna remove the front bearing retainer. Just a little tap with a rubber mallet and it's off. There's the counter shaft front bearing and its snap rings. And here's one special leg I made for the puller. They bent, so I had to make new stronger ones for the rest of the bearings. The bearing is full roller style, so there's no cage of the rollers. Here's the rear bearing retainer. Just a little tap with the mallet and off it goes. And then I'm pulling out the fifth gear, being careful not to damage the gear teeth. Fifth gear seems to be just fine. Here we have the counter shaft rear bearing and a snap ring around it. The bearing is is without the inner race, and that's the weak point of the gearbox. This bearing wears out the surface of the counter shaft. Here we have the input shaft. It's just fine. There are the needle rollers inside of it. Here's the gearbox and transfer case taken apart. Now measuring the runout of the main shaft. It seems to be just fine. Okay, let's see what we have here. We found some wear. This is the transfer case idler shaft, and the surface of it has some serious marks on it. And the idler gear inside surface has some pitting on the other side. It doesn't look bad yet, but it can escalate. Here's the main shaft in perfect condition. All the surfaces are good, splines are good. Main shaft nut and bearing. All the bearings actually come in the rebuild kit, so they're gonna be replaced. Here's the power takeoff gear, which we saw earlier. Spacer, and here's the transfer input gear. There's nothing wrong with it. Bearing and spacer. And here's the fifth gear, nothing wrong with it. Rear bearing retainer, good. Here's a bearing I had to weld to get off. And then we have the first gear and a thrust washer. First gear seems to be just fine. Teeth are good. This is the second synchro assembly, which grabs nice and tight to the first gear. I actually compared with this synchro assembly with the new one. Only difference was the teeth, which have seen some life on this one, but otherwise I think this is in pretty much perfect condition. The synchros itself are grabbing really well, and the shifting motion works really fine. Here we have the roller of the second gear. It's gonna come in the kit. Second gear itself, it's just good. Some minor thrust for sure surface wear, but it's good. Here's the third gear bushing, which is instead of a bearing, it's in good condition, and the third gear itself, nothing wrong with it. I also measured the oil clearance between third gear and the bushing, and it was really good. And synchro ring is just okay, nothing wrong with it. Snap ring, and then we have the third, fourth gear sleeve and the splined piece. Okay, then we have the transfer idler shaft, which we saw earlier. It has some wear on it, and luckily it comes in the transfer rebuild kit, so it's gonna be replaced. Also the rollers come in the kit and gonna be replaced, and the thrust washers also. There's a spacer between the rollers and it's gonna be reused, so don't miss it. And here's the idler gear, which has some pitting inside. It's gonna be replaced. Otherwise the teeth are good, no problems, but the pitting inside the bearing surface is going to wear out. I don't know how fast, but I want to make this reliable and strong, so it's gonna be replaced. Input shaft is good. Here we have the pilot bearing. It fits nicely and there's no wear on the nose of the input shaft. The counter shaft looks just fine. The front bearing is here. It's a full roller style. The new one's gonna be a caged roller. Maybe it works better. That's why they've changed it in the rebuild kit. There's a snap ring, and here we have the problem. Teeth are okay, but here the rear countershaft bearing surface has some pitting on it and it's going to wear out. I don't know if it's a month or two or a year, but it's good to change now when it's all open. And here's the bearing without the inner race, which has worn out the shaft. Here we have a little pin and a washer. Then we have the 5th counter gear and the halves of the needle roller. 5th counter gear is just fine, nothing wrong. New bearings come in the kit. And then we have the sleeve in perfect condition. And yeah, it works fine. Detent springs, perfect, nothing wrong with them. Shift keys, okay. And then we have the spline piece. I couldn't find anything wrong with it, and the synchro ring actually was really good too. And the 5th shift arm is in good condition. And here's the nut, which comes in the kit. Here we have the reverse idler shaft, which is in perfect condition, and the reverse idler. Nothing wrong with it either. And next we have the transfer rear output shaft. It has some minor marks on the high gear side, but the high gear is going to be locked to the shaft 99% of the time. And when it's rotating on low range, there's gonna be plenty of oil between and the speed isn't too high, so I'm going to reuse this one. Otherwise the shaft is in good condition. Snap ring, spline piece for the 4-wheel drive, the rear bearing, and here we have the high gear with some marks on the teeth. It's gonna be replaced. I probably damaged it during the disassembly, or maybe it has damaged already before. Otherwise it was okay, just small chipping in the teeth. Then we have the sleeve between high and low gear. It's just good. slides well. Then we have the low gear, which is in perfect condition, rarely used. Most of the time it's just idling on the shaft. No power coming through it. The bronze bearing inside of it is good. Here we have the front bearing, and this is the Speedo drive gear. It's just fine. And the last we have the rear companion flange. It's gonna be reused, and the gasket, the seal surface is good, and the washer and nut which comes in the kit. Then we have the transfer front output shaft, which is fine, nothing wrong with it. It connects to the rear shaft with a small needle roller. And here's the sleeve which connects the four-wheel drive. And this is the four-wheel drive shift arm. Here's a ball bearing and a snap ring. Actually, that was the oil slinger. And here we have the snap ring. And the front companion flange, good. New nut comes in the kit. And new gaskets and seals, of course. Next time we'll put this all together. And if you want to see more of these videos, please subscribe.